We have already examined a broad range of UFO encounters reported at locations all across the globe. This week, however, we will be focusing on a series of sightings which allegedly took place within the Soviet Union. Stories in which the Soviet government had been repeatedly forced to confront and evaluate the existence of potentially unearthly enemies of the state. It should perhaps come as little surprise that the majority of high-profile UFO encounters have reportedly taken place within the borders of the United States. A nation so vast in territory, possessing layers of both regional and national media outlets, there seems no end to the manner in which those who have experienced strange occurrences can share their stories with others, regardless of how often they are ridiculed. Since the term flying saucer was first coined by Kenneth Arnold, following his encounter with a series of unidentified flying objects in 1947, North America has played host to a seemingly unending succession of purported UFO encounters. These have ranged from the alleged crash of an alien spacecraft at Roswell in New Mexico, right up to the recent video recordings of unknown high-speed aerial vehicles by American Navy pilots, and everything in between. Such cases have often prompted the media to ask open and unwanted questions of the US military, resulting in instances of bemused officials having been brought out in front of the cameras to offer some form of explanation. And yet the same level of reporting is not found in countries of a similar or even greater size. This prompts the question, what is it about the USA which extraterrestrials are so enamored with? For example, there seems to be precious few such stories to have emerged from the Eastern Hemisphere, either in modern times or the era of the Soviet Union. A brief trawl through the internet finds no obvious reference to any member of the Soviet government taking a formal stance on the potential existence of visitors from another planet. And yet, a growing number of stories are now coming to light, which suggest the country's leaders have in fact faced repeated encounters with unearthly intruders. In February of 1985, two train drivers by the names of Orlov and Mironov were transporting 70 empty freight containers in order to collect iron ore from a refinery situated in the northwestern town of Kostomuksha. The journey they had undertaken was a regular one. It took them right across the barren and open expanse of the Karelian territories, and was usually an uneventful jaunt. The pair had been whiling away their time in the cabin of the vehicle when Orlov had suddenly caught sight of something resembling a large ball of light, travelling parallel to the railway tracks just above a nearby tree line. As they observed, the glowing sphere drastically increased its speed, before it suddenly swerved sideways and began to travel along the tracks directly ahead of the train. Crying out in alarm, Orlov grabbed hold of the engine's brake, fearing that a collision would almost certainly take place if the strange object ahead of them in any way slowed down. But despite his best efforts, including powering down the engine's propulsion system, the train continued on its path. If anything, it now seemed to be gathering speed, as though the object travelling before them was somehow pulling them along in its wake. Unable to slow the locomotive down, Mironov used the vehicle's radio to make a panic call to staff at the train station in Novopesky, which they were now rapidly approaching at high speed. The female operator who took the call could make little sense of what the terrified driver was trying to tell her, but was suddenly startled by the sound of shouting coming from the platform directly outside her office. Hurrying out of the room, she and a small gathering of staff and passengers observed a glowing object roughly 13 feet in diameter hurtling along the tracks towards them, directly ahead of the approaching train. But just prior to reaching the platforms, this strange craft veered sharply off to one side, disappearing from view and leaving the speeding locomotive to hurtle through the station with its brakes and engine still completely inoperative. Moments later, as the train fully cleared the platforms, Mironov and Orlov felt it beginning to slow down, but their sense of elation was immediately crushed as the object suddenly veered into view ahead of them once again. Gradually, despite the vehicle's brakes still being engaged and the engines being powered down, the train began to gather momentum, seemingly dragged along at high velocity behind the silent and speeding craft. This strange encounter would continue for another hour, with the train travelling over 30 miles behind the glowing object before it again disappeared from view, this time for good. When the train finally ground to a halt in Zastava, the two engineers were amazed to discover that they had somehow managed to save over 300 kilograms of fuel due to this mystifying incident. In addition to this, the windscreen of the train cabin and the frontal bodywork were both visibly damaged as a result of impacts from various objects, thrown up by the unknown craft as it had pulled them along behind it. But of the mysterious object itself, there was no physical trace anywhere to be found. 4 years later, and on the other side of the vast and sprawling Soviet territories, one of the most high-profile UFO incidents to be reported in Russian history would allegedly occur in the industrial city of Voronezh. On the morning of September the 28th, 1989, a number of bizarre reports began to circulate through state media. It gradually became clear that an incident had taken place during the previous night in one of the city's central park areas, and had been witnessed by a large group of residents. At approximately 6:30 PM that evening, people out walking and playing in Levon Park suddenly became aware of a strange glowing shape, which was hovering low in the skies above them. The various descriptions of this odd craft all seem to concur that it was somewhere in the region of 45 feet in diameter and 18 feet in height, with a metallic surface which was somehow emitting a dull red colour. Whilst more and more people began to assemble in the park, they looked on in wonder as the strange vessel began to descend slowly to the ground. As it did so, 4 thin metallic legs unfolded from inside its lower section, before it touched down on the ground near to where a group of teenage boys were playing football together after school. With the watching crowd, swollen by the addition of another 40 bystanders who had been waiting at a nearby bus stop, there were now over 100 witnesses to what took place next. As the boys stopped their game of football, a hatch on the underside of the object opened. Moments later, a stocky, 9-foot-tall entity emerged, wearing some kind of silvery jumpsuit, as well as a pair of bronze-coloured boots. The creature's head was significantly smaller when compared to the rest of its body. It had a large saucer-shaped eye mounted either side of its face, with a smaller third eye situated directly in the centre, which seemed to be swivelling back and forth as it scanned the surrounding area. With whatever degree of assessment it was undertaking having apparently been completed, the ship's occupant was then joined by 2 more identical figures, all 3 wearing disc-like plates affixed to the front of their suits. A much smaller box-shaped construction then materialised from inside the craft behind the trio. It proceeded to move along the ground behind them, travelling as it did so with an awkward and almost robotic gait. This mechanical creation would occasionally stop and reach down to the ground, apparently taking soil and grass samples at the direction of the three taller figures walking before it. A sense of panic suddenly rippled through the ranks of the assembled witnesses, with several of the younger members crying out in terror. It is from this point onwards that accounts of what took place begin to vary somewhat. Several of the witnesses later claim that the craft and its occupants suddenly disappeared from sight, only to then rematerialize a few minutes later at the exact same point they had vanished from. Others would describe how one of the entities produced a thick metallic tube, roughly a foot in length, which it then aimed directly at one of the crying teenagers. The youth in question seemed to dematerialize under the power of whatever invisible beam was being produced by this device, before reappearing several minutes later as the creatures and their craft then made their departure. With several of the witnesses to this incident being soldiers and police officers, it was later reported in the local news that the city authorities had deemed that the matter justified a formal investigation. It was alleged that several trees had apparently either been broken or bent backwards as they were situated in the path of the descending craft. Investigators also reported detecting higher levels of background radiation than should have been present, as well as traces of a strange mineral deposit, which had never been found anywhere else on Earth. Further reports were made in the months which followed of both flying craft and creatures in the skies above Voronezh, but would go on to be dismissed as the result of mass hysteria. A significant number of residents in the city maintain to this day that their visitors on that fateful autumn evening were very real, and that judging by their unearthly appearance, could not possibly have been from this world. But as unsettling as the previous two encounters were for those who were involved, by far the most disturbing report to have ever emerged from this part of the world reportedly occurred in a remote region of Siberia during the winter of 1993, in the post-Soviet era. This incident was apparently detailed in a 250-page intelligence document, which was later declassified by the CIA. It described a nightmarish confrontation between Russian troops and an alien craft, which took place somewhere inside the vast expanse of the Siberian wilderness. The encounter allegedly began when a detachment of infantrymen from one of the garrisons in the area had been deployed on a training exercise. They had become aware of an unidentified object hovering over a tract of isolated and remote woodland. Immediately assessing it to be hostile in nature, several of the men had promptly utilized a surface-to-air missile launcher to take down the craft, which then spun wildly out of control for several seconds before crashing into a nearby clearing. As the army unit had spread out to surround and take control of the fallen object, 5 beings had emerged from inside it to meet them, which were described as being stumpy in appearance but possessing large black eyes. As a pair of the Russian troopers had approached the creatures with their weapons drawn and demanding their surrender, one of the entities had instead opened fire on them with a mysterious weapon. Moments later, the 2 soldiers were instantly transformed into living statues, composed of some unknown form of rock or hard mineral. The 5 entities then immediately began firing indiscriminately at the other troops who were surrounding them. Only 2 of the Russian soldiers who were present managed to successfully flee from the slaughter. The rest of their comrades were all killed in the same terrifying fashion. When a much larger force from the garrison later returned to the scene with the survivors, equipped with both armoured vehicle and helicopter support, they found that the craft and its occupants were now missing. But still littered around the empty clearing were the frozen bodies of 23 of their comrades, somehow converted into grotesque, mineral representations of the brave fighting men they had once been. The extensive briefing document goes on to allege that the KGB was soon involved. The incident was quietly hushed up, and the remains of the dead soldiers were shipped off to a laboratory in Moscow for detailed study. Intriguingly, the scientists involved in the analysis of the bodies were unable to identify the exact composition of the substance which had entombed the dead soldiers. All that could be ascertained was that it was apparently extraterrestrial in nature, and somewhat similar in chemical structure to terrestrial limestone. Perhaps the most obvious difference which sets these reports from the Eastern Hemisphere well apart from the many which have emerged from the United States is the large number of witnesses involved in each of the incidents. Whereas the overwhelming majority of the sightings to have been documented in the USA feature groups of 2 or 3 witnesses in most cases, in all of the stories which have emerged from Russia, there was always a sizable number present, somewhat making it impossible for the government to write off or cover up. And if, by some chance, the sheer number of eyewitnesses has in some way contributed to the advent of these stories breaking free from the veil of Soviet secrecy and being disseminated throughout the rest of the world, it raises potentially troubling questions. If, like in the USA, there have been further, countless incidents where only a handful of witnesses have been involved, what did the Soviet government do with the testimonies of those concerned, and with the people themselves? Are there still countless stories waiting to be told, which add even more weight to the notion of extraterrestrial visitors to our planet? The full, undisclosed truth of the matter remains to be seen.